He thought it was just a joke, a dismissive phrase tossed across the chamber like a casual insult. "Little lady," he called her, with a smirk and a chuckle, as if her facts, her fire, and her presence didn't belong in the room. But what happened next? That wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a moment that would ripple through every corner of Congress. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She just rose, not just from her seat, but into a chapter of history no one in that hearing room would forget. And when she spoke, the room, the whole damn chamber, fell silent. Because this isn't just a story about disrespect. It's about what happens when a woman, young, brilliant, and unshakably composed, turns a moment of condescension into a moment of reckoning. And though what you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling, every word, every glance, every silence in this story draws from something very real, the lived experience of too many women, especially women of color, who have had to fight twice as hard to be heard once. This is not just politics, this is power. And it all started with two words. Little lady. The clock read 5:32 a.m. In the soft amber glow of a single desk lamp, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moved quietly through her modest Washington apartment. No entourage, no makeup chair. Just the stillness before a storm she knew was coming. Outside, D.C. was still asleep, but inside the air buzzed, not with noise, but with intention. On the small kitchen counter sat a chipped ceramic mug, steam curling from fresh cafecito. Next to it, like it always was before a big hearing, stood a framed photo of her abuela, smiling in a church dress that looked borrowed, slightly too big at the shoulders. Her abuela had crossed borders, crossed time zones, and crossed lines that weren't supposed to be crossed. For her. That photo wasn't just tradition, it was armor. AOC paused, then whispered to the photo like she always did. "Let them talk. I'll speak louder, with truth." She sipped the cafecito, strong, bitter, real. Just like what was coming. On the dining table, an organized storm of documents waited. Defense Department memos, no AA maps, line-by-line funding charts. But there was one page she kept folding and unfolding, like a talisman. It wasn't a graph or a speech. It was a handwritten letter from a high school girl in the Bronx. "If you ever feel alone in there, just remember, we're watching. We've never had someone like you." "Not really." AOC smiled at the letter, then folded it once more and tucked it behind her hearing notes. She moved to the mirror. No glam team, no false lashes, just a firm, steady hand tracing a line of eyeliner. A calculated gesture. Enough to look sharp, not enough to look intimidating. In this town, women didn't get to be angry. They only got to be emotional. And if you were young and brown, every blink got judged like a policy vote. From the hallway, a voice memo played on repeat. "Randy Weber, Republican, Texas, oil-backed, discredits Pentagon climate reports, called me agitated in last hearing. Watch for sarcasm." She played it again. Memorizing tone, rhythm, pattern, like a boxer watching footage before a fight. But this wasn't just a hearing, not anymore. She stared at the screen, then slowly turned back to the mirror. "Today," she whispered, "they'll remember who I am." In the corner of the room, her cat Deco let out a soft meow, as if to second the motion. She slipped on a white blazer, crisp, clean, symbolic. It was the same shade the suffragettes wore when they stood on Capitol steps, daring to imagine a future like this. A future that still, somehow, wasn't ready. But here's the part she hadn't told anyone, not even her staffers. Last night, she'd had a dream. She was standing in that hearing room, and everyone else was gone. No cameras, no microphones, just her and a voice, a man's voice, laughing. "You really think they'll listen to you?" it said. "Watch me," she'd replied in the dream. Then silence. Now standing in real daylight, she opened her front door. The hallway outside was quiet. No one there to clap, no one there to boo. Just one woman stepping into a day she knew would change something. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was how it would change her. Because in just 4 hours, a man across the aisle would call her little lady, and the words would ricochet across America like a slap across a microphone. And when it happened, the cameras would catch her face, not flinching, not blinking, just rising. The car ride to Capitol Hill was brief, but Alexandria barely noticed the turns. Her thoughts were already in the chamber, pacing ahead of her like invisible footprints she knew she would have to fill. She glanced out the window at the gray morning light washing over D.C., dulling the stone and steel of the buildings that lined Constitution Avenue. It always struck her how permanent the city tried to look, as if power had always belonged here, in these walls, in these chairs, as if someone like her was still just passing through. At the curb, a wave of camera shutters greeted her before she even stepped out. The press had caught wind that today's hearing might spark fireworks, but they didn't know how close they were to the flame. She smiled slightly, not for the cameras, but to remind herself, stay grounded, stay sharp, and above all, stay undistracted. Inside, the marble halls buzzed with staffers, some new, some weathered by years of hallway whispers and backroom deals. She walked briskly, her aides trailing behind with binders and briefing folders. A few faces turned to look, not with hostility, but with that subtle mixture of curiosity and doubt that had followed her since the day she took her oath. A young woman, Latina, unbought, unbossed, and not afraid to speak plainly. She was still a disruption to some, and to others she was a thread in heels. As she approached the committee room, a familiar ache settled in her chest. Not fear, just the quiet tension of being the only one in the room who would have to prove, again, that she belonged. She adjusted her blazer and pushed the door open. The Oversight Committee chamber was already half full. The climate security hearing was officially titled National Resilience, Assessing the Department of Defense's Response to Environmental Threats. But behind the bureaucratic name was a simple truth. The planet was burning, and some of the very people in this room were still debating whether they should care. She scanned the dais, row after row of dark suits and graying hair. Most of them men, most of them white. All of them with long tenure and longer donor lists. At the far end, she spotted Randy Weber. He wasn't looking up. His face glowed faintly from the light of his phone screen. Scrolling, probably Twitter, or maybe a fundraising update from one of the fossil fuel PACs that had his loyalty on speed dial. She took her seat. There was a soft rustle as nameplates were adjusted and microphones tested. A gavel banged gently to call the session to order. Formalities began. Acknowledgements, the reading of procedural rules, a recap of witness credentials. Alexandria kept her expression neutral, but inside she cataloged the room like a chessboard. Who would speak first? Who would stall? Who would provoke? Who would try to silence her? When it was her turn, she would have 5 minutes, just 5, but that was all she needed. Next to her, a staffer slipped her a last-minute update, a Pentagon memo reaffirming climate as a national security threat multiplier. She nodded. It was precisely the kind of language Weber had once called liberal fiction. That was fine. She didn't need fiction. She had facts, and something more. She looked across the room again. Weber had finally put his phone down. He was saying something in a low tone to the congressman beside him, who laughed and nodded. Alexandria couldn't hear them, but she didn't have to. She knew the rhythm by now, the casual chuckle, the quiet dismissal, the sense that she was a performance to be tolerated, not a policymaker to be respected. That was fine too, because the truth doesn't need permission to speak. It just needs a mic. And today she had one. The chairman's voice echoed through the chamber, formal and steady as he opened the floor. The room was still settling in, but Alexandria was already in position, back straight, hands folded on her notes, eyes clear and forward. She'd learned early on that posture mattered just as much as policy in these rooms. You could speak with precision, with data, with calm fire in your voice, but if your shoulders slouched or your gaze wandered, they'd say you looked unsure, or worse, emotional. As her name was called for opening remarks, she reached for the mic, adjusted it slightly, and nodded in acknowledgement. Her tone was crisp, measured, deliberate. She began not with politics, but with consequences. Rising sea levels and crumbling naval bases, droughts hollowing out farm towns, Soldiers deployed not just to war zones, but to disaster zones. She framed climate not as theory, but as threat. A threat to readiness, to infrastructure, to lives. Halfway through her statement, as she cited the Pentagon's own 2023 climate risk analysis, a sound broke her rhythm, barely audible, but enough to register. A long, theatrical sigh. It came from Weber's seat. Alexandria didn't flinch, but her eyes moved just enough to see him, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. As she continued speaking, he leaned over to whisper something to the congressman beside him. The other man snorted, then stifled a grin behind his hand. Neither of them looked in her direction again. They didn't need to. She kept going. A moment later, as she quoted the Navy's request for climate-resilient infrastructure, Weber made a slow, deliberate show of rolling his eyes, his head tilting back slightly, mouth curled into a half-smile of disbelief. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't new, but it was intentional. Every movement, every sigh, every smirk, it all sent the same message. You don't belong here. This was how it worked, not with shouting or open insult, not yet, but with the slow erosion of attention, with small gestures designed to chip away at presence, to shrink someone mid-sentence without even interrupting them. It was passive, plausible, and effective, unless you knew how to see it. Alexandria had learned to see it years ago, on debate stages, in boardrooms, in city council chambers where men twice her age would ma'am her out of seriousness. She recognized it now, not with surprise, but with a quiet sort of recognition, the kind that says, ah, so this is the play today. She didn't pause. She didn't even look their way again. Instead, she turned the page in her notes a touch more deliberately, her fingers firm. Every word that followed landed more precisely, like the sharpening of a blade rather than the raising of a voice. Because she knew the trick wasn't just to speak, it was to make them wish they'd listened. And somewhere deep in the rhythm of her statement, beneath the numbers and citations, there was a current, a silent, gathering pressure. A sense that the real storm hadn't started yet. Not quite, but it was coming, and Randy Weber, still smirking in his seat, had no idea just how cold that wind would get. The gavel tapped twice. Formalities concluded, the first round of questioning began. Alexandria adjusted her mic with calm precision, the same way a violinist might draw in breath before a solo. Her voice entered the room clear and steady, not loud but purposeful. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to document truth. I'd like to direct the committee's attention, she began, to the Department of Defense Climate Risk Analysis, issued just last year, which classifies climate change as, quote, a threat multiplier with direct implications for national security strategy. Her fingers tapped the edge of a printed report as she continued. That's not my language. That's the Pentagon's. She paused just long enough to let the words land before turning to the large map displayed on the digital screen behind her. Red dots clustered across the southeastern U.S. coastline, marking vulnerable military installations. This is Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia. Rising seas are expected to impact its critical infrastructure within the next decade. Here is Naval Station Norfolk, facing recurrent flooding that's already disrupted operations 3 times in the past year. And here, Fort Hood in Texas, where extreme heat is degrading training capabilities. Again, these are not activist reports. These are internal DoD risk memos reviewed by bipartisan analysts. She shifted slightly, her tone still measured but carrying weight now. If we are to fulfill our oath to protect this nation, a sound cut her off. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice the air in half. A single chuckle, followed by the unmistakable voice of Representative Randy Weber. Oh, calm down, little lady, he said, leaning back in his seat, arms folded like he just delivered a punchline. You're not in a TikTok debate. The words were light, offhand, almost playful, but they landed with the weight of a slap. Several in the room chuckled reflexively, more from discomfort than agreement. One aide dropped her pen. Another looked straight down. A male congressman stifled a grin behind a legal pad. The air in the room changed, not drastically, but decisively. The kind of shift that comes not with thunder, but with a chill. Alexandria didn't move. She didn't blink. Her eyes stayed fixed on her notes for a moment longer, as if giving the room a chance to catch up to itself. Then she lifted her gaze, not at Weber, but just beyond him, as if looking through him. Her voice, when she continued, was unchanged. But her silence, in that beat before she spoke again, said more than any rebuttal could. She marked her place with her pen and returned to the map on screen. As I was saying, she began again, not looking in Weber's direction. Climate disruptions are not political abstractions. They are measurable, they are military relevant, and they are increasing in frequency and severity. If some in this chamber find that fact threatening, then I suggest we take that as confirmation of its urgency. A few heads turned. A couple eyebrows rose. One staffer sitting in the back gave a slight shake of the head, as if to say, "He's going to regret that." But Weber seemed unfazed. He leaned over again and muttered something to the man beside him, who offered a silent laugh in return. Alexandria didn't respond. Not yet, because sometimes the most devastating answers come later, when the facts are lined up like dominoes, when the smirks fade, when the mic is still on, and the silence breaks clean. For now, she let him talk, because soon she would speak louder. With truth. There was something about how she kept going that unsettled the room. Not with volume, not with confrontation, but with an eerie composure that refused to crack. Alexandria continued her presentation exactly where she had left off, as if nothing had happened. Her voice was steady, her data precise, but the temperature beneath her words had shifted. You could hear it in the cadence. Less explanatory now, more surgical. Less like someone offering information, more like someone building a case. Behind her, on the oversized screen, a new map lit up. Military-grade risk assessments of water scarcity projections across the Southwest. She spoke about supply chain disruptions, military logistics in natural disasters, the implications of mass climate migration on border stability. Her fingers moved methodically along her notes, underlining phrases, flipping pages without pause. Not a hair out of place, not a breath wasted. But the room had changed. Staffers leaned toward each other, whispering behind folders. One of the younger female aides scribbled something rapidly in the margins of her briefing packet. Jaw set tight. The woman next to her nodded once. Eyes narrowed and reached for her phone. Phones began to vibrate silently across the back row. A handful of them, pulled discreetly from jackets and pockets, began to light up with notifications, tweets, threads, and fragments of the moment that had just happened. Little lady? Did Weber really say that out loud? Chamber just got icy. AOC not reacting. Watch this space. Even the committee reporter in the corner stopped typing and simply stared, waiting to see if something would snap. But nothing did, and that in itself began to feel like a challenge. At his seat, Randy Weber reclined just slightly, lips pressed into the kind of smirk worn by men who think they won something. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. In his mind, the jab had landed, and there'd been no clapback, no fire, no fury, no how dare you, just silence, which to him meant surrender. She took it, he thought, pleased with himself. Maybe she's smarter than I thought, knows not to bite when she's outnumbered. And that was the mistake, because what Weber hadn't understood, and what the cameras couldn't capture, was the calculation happening behind Alexandria's stillness. She hadn't taken it. She had filed it, indexed it, positioned it carefully in the narrative she was already constructing. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was choice, and it was strategy. She knew better than to give a man like Weber what he wanted. A rise, a spark, something to mock later as overreaction. Instead, she left him with the illusion of victory, wrapped neatly in a moment of control he would mistake for dominance. And as he leaned back, satisfied, Alexandria adjusted the microphone once more and returned to the numbers. Based on the Defense Department's own modeling, she continued, her tone almost surgical now, over 60 military installations face climate-related operational risk within the next 20 years. That includes Fort Bliss, Camp Pendleton, and the U.S. Naval Academy. Weber glanced toward her briefly, expecting, what? A crack? A sideways glare? Still nothing. Just facts. But facts have weight, and they fall quietly until suddenly they land all at once. A few more minutes passed. Alexandria concluded her remarks, thanked the chair, and turned off her mic. She didn't look at Weber. She didn't need to, because in the space between what he had said and what she had not, a line had already been drawn. And when she crossed it, later, it wouldn't be with noise. It would be with impact. The moment the chairman tapped the gavel and called for recess, the energy in the chamber began to shift. Conversations resumed, papers shuffled, staffers leaned into hurried whispers, and chairs screeched slightly as members rose to stretch or strategize in corners. But Alexandria didn't linger. She gathered her materials quietly, tucking her notes into a slim black folder with precise, unflinching movements. Her face betrayed nothing, not irritation, not fatigue, not even thought. Just motion, smooth, practiced, unreadable. She walked the hallway alone. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she passed familiar portraits of men long dead and laws long debated. The air was cooler in these hallways, quieter, like a cathedral built not for faith, but for posture. She nodded at a staffer who offered a polite "Congresswoman," but she didn't stop. Her steps were steady, but something behind her eyes had changed. Not broken, sharpened. As she approached her office, the silence around her grew louder, and a memory uninvited but vivid surfaced with uncanny clarity. It was 2 years ago, at a high-dollar fundraiser in Manhattan, one of those rooms where champagne passed as policy and the walls echoed with civility but not sincerity. A well-known donor, mid-60s, cufflinks gleaming, a benefactor of several centrist campaigns, had leaned in after a panel and said, just low enough to make it seem intimate, "You're too cute to be this angry all the time." He'd laughed like it was charm. She hadn't laughed back. Instead, she had held his gaze long enough to make him uncomfortable, thanked him for his support, and walked away. But the words had lingered, not because they were new, but because they were recycled, reshaped, repeated in different voices, all part of the same refrain. Sit down, smile more. Don't take it personally. Don't be so emotional. Know your place. And now, little lady, she reached her office, closed the door gently behind her, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, she stood still, not out of hesitation, but because silence was a strategy and a sanctuary. On the edge of her desk sat a manila folder she had labeled the night before. The handwriting on the tab was neat, all caps, Phase 2. She didn't pick it up right away. Instead, she glanced at the corner of her desk, where the photo of her abuela stood, half framed in morning light. The same quiet smile, the same borrowed dress. "They never learn," she whispered. Then she reached for the folder, opened it slowly, and began to read. Inside were 3 sections: legal precedents on professional conduct in hearings, compiled transcripts of past microaggressions in congressional sessions, and a full packet of annotated data. Pentagon, no AI, FEMA, complete with quotes Weber had previously dismissed as unsubstantiated. It wasn't revenge she was planning. It was something far more potent: preparation. Because the real answer hadn't come yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just be personal, it would be permanent. The moment the chairman tapped the gavel and called for recess, the energy in the chamber began to shift. Conversations resumed, papers shuffled, staffers leaned into hurried whispers, and chairs screeched slightly as members rose to stretch or strategize in corners. But Alexandria didn't linger. She gathered her materials quietly, tucking her notes into a slim black folder with precise, unflinching movements. Her face betrayed nothing, not irritation, not fatigue, not even thought. Just motion, smooth, practiced, unreadable. She walked the hallway alone. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she passed familiar portraits of men long dead and laws long debated. The air was cooler in these hallways, quieter, like a cathedral built not for faith, but for posture. She nodded at a staffer who offered a polite "Congresswoman," but she didn't stop. Her steps were steady, but something behind her eyes had changed. Not broken, sharpened. As she approached her office, the silence around her grew louder, and a memory uninvited but vivid surfaced with uncanny clarity. It was 2 years ago, at a high-dollar fundraiser in Manhattan, one of those rooms where champagne passed as policy and the walls echoed with civility but not sincerity. A well-known donor, mid-60s, cufflinks gleaming, a benefactor of several centrist campaigns, had leaned in after a panel and said, just low enough to make it seem intimate, "You're too cute to be this angry all the time." He'd laughed like it was charm. She hadn't laughed back. Instead, she had held his gaze long enough to make him uncomfortable, thanked him for his support, and walked away. But the words had lingered, not because they were new, but because they were recycled, reshaped, repeated in different voices, all part of the same refrain. Sit down, smile more, don't take it personally, don't be so emotional, know your place. And now, little lady. She reached her office, closed the door gently behind her, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, she stood still, not out of hesitation, but because silence was a strategy and a sanctuary. On the edge of her desk sat a manila folder she had labeled the night before. The handwriting on the tab was neat, all caps, Phase 2. She didn't pick it up right away. Instead, she glanced at the corner of her desk where the photo of her abuela stood, half framed in morning light. The same quiet smile, the same borrowed dress. They never learn, she whispered. Then she reached for the folder, opened it slowly, and began to read. Inside were 3 sections: legal precedents on professional conduct in hearings, compiled transcripts of past microaggressions in congressional sessions, and a full packet of annotated data, Pentagon, NOAA, FEMA, complete with quotes Weber had previously dismissed as unsubstantiated. It wasn't revenge she was planning. It was something far more potent. Preparation, because the real answer hadn't come yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just be personal, it would be permanent. It was just past 10:30 p.m. when the last staffer closed the door to the conference room. The Capitol had quieted down, the way it always did after dark, buzzing hallways now dim and still, emptied of press, lobbyists, and noise. But in the corner suite of Alexandria's office, light still poured from underneath the frosted glass, casting long shadows across a cluttered table layered with binders, printouts, and half-drunk coffee cups. The mood in the room was focused but charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. 4 of her closest aides sat around the table: policy analysts, communications leads, her chief of staff leaning forward with a yellow notepad. A whiteboard stood against the wall, already covered with hand-scrawled terms: respect, gender bias, historical precedent, congressional code of conduct. In the center of the board, circled twice in red, little lady. Alexandria stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much yet. She was listening, watching how the team moved through the problem. They were combing through congressional archives, pulling footage from past hearings, isolating moments where women, particularly women of color, had been subtly or not so subtly diminished. It was a longer list than anyone wanted to admit. One aide scrolled through C-SPAN transcripts, highlighting quotes: "Calm down, miss. You're out of your depth. Let the gentleman speak." Another pulled up a hearing clip from 2014 where a black congresswoman had been told she was getting emotional for raising her voice about police funding. And then there were the stories that hadn't been recorded, just shared between women in hallways after the camera stopped rolling. But it wasn't just about compiling examples. They were building something, framing something, and they all knew it. Finally, her chief of staff leaned back, brows furrowed. "Okay," he said carefully. "So, let's talk about the move. We've got the clip. We've got the data. But are you sure you want to go there? I mean, Weber said something dumb. Everyone heard it. People are already dragging him online. You responding now, it risks making this about you. About that one comment. That could backfire." Alexandria didn't answer right away. She looked down at the notes in front of her. Not at the quotes or data, but at a folded piece of paper tucked between briefing sheets. The letter from the Bronx girl. The same one she had carried into the hearing that morning. She unfolded it slowly, ran a thumb over the ink, then looked up. "No," she said, voice low but certain. "I'm not making this about one comment. I'm making it about all the times we didn't fight back. The room went quiet. She continued, I'm making it about every woman who's been told to calm down when she was just starting to get heard. Every staffer who got called sweetheart in a meeting. Every woman who knew that speaking up would cost her more than staying silent, and stayed silent anyway. I'm not mad that he called me little lady. I'm mad that he thought he could. And I want to make sure the next one who tries it thinks twice. There was a pause, then one of the younger aides, a woman barely out of grad school, spoke up. So we don't just clap back, we name the pattern. Alexandria nodded. Exactly. We tell the story bigger than me, because it is bigger than me. Outside the window, the Capitol dome stood illuminated against the night sky, silent but watching. Inside, the war room had found its charge. The real hearing hadn't even started yet, but the strategy was already in motion. Long after the meeting ended and the staff had gone home, Alexandria sat alone in her office with the lights dimmed low and the sound of the city murmuring faintly through the windows. The folders were still on the table, the whiteboard still covered in red ink and intent. But her mind wasn't on strategy now. It had drifted somewhere quieter, somewhere older. The kind of place memory goes when it needs to remind you who you are. She could still see the town hall from 2 years earlier. The one in the Bronx gymnasium with the flickering fluorescent lights and the folding chairs lined up with more hope than stability. It wasn't an easy crowd. These weren't people who trusted quickly. They were tired, working class, and used to being spoken at, not spoken for. But she remembered the woman in the third row, the one who stood up with her baby on her hip and frustration in her voice. The woman didn't ask a question. She didn't need to. Her voice cracked slightly, but her words were iron. No one in that room speaks for me, except you. It hadn't felt like a compliment. It felt like a responsibility, like someone had placed a weight in her hands and said, carry this carefully. Because people weren't just looking to her for inspiration. They were watching to see if she could survive the blows and still stand. She had stood, but the weight never left. Alexandria leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Another image rose, uninvited but sharp. A college debate round during her sophomore year. Ivy League tournament. Packed room. She'd been the only woman of color in that bracket, and she could still hear the way one of the opposing debaters had started his rebuttal with a smirk. And the words, well, that was certainly passionate, maybe a bit theatrical, but we applaud the energy. The audience had laughed, not cruelly, just comfortably, as if they were in on the joke, as if that one sentence hadn't just flattened everything she had worked to say. She remembered gripping her notepad so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had waited her turn, she had played by the rules, and when her rebuttal came, she had lowered her voice, tried to sound even more reasonable, tried not to confirm their worst assumptions. She'd left that room furious, at him, yes, but more at herself for shrinking to fit their mold. She opened her eyes. Not this time. That same patronizing tone had returned today, but in a different building, with more expensive suits, and now broadcast to millions. Little lady, a throwaway phrase maybe to the men who laughed, but she knew what it really meant. It was a cue, a reminder that her presence was tolerated, not welcomed, that the mic in front of her had been earned, but could still be mocked. That being young and Latina and unshaken in her conviction was still too much for some to handle. But this time, she wouldn't lower her voice. She wouldn't smile politely and pretend it hadn't happened. Because this time, she didn't just carry her own story. She carried that woman from the Bronx, that college girl who hadn't fought back, the staffers who'd shared their own stories over coffee and quiet tears. She looked over at the folder marked Phase 2. The fire was already burning, and tomorrow she'd make sure it had a name. It was close to midnight now, but Alexandria showed no signs of fatigue. Her jacket was off, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back in a loose knot. The office was quiet except for the gentle hum of her laptop and the occasional scratch of her pen on paper. The Capitol building, lit like a monument to permanence, glowed in the distance through her window. But inside this room, something fluid and alive was taking shape. The kind of clarity that only arrives after the adrenaline has settled and the decision has already been made. She sat cross-legged at the conference table, surrounded by documents that had long since lost their bureaucratic sheen and now looked more like weapons. Department of Defense climate threat assessments, NOAA flooding projections, state-by-state data on infrastructure vulnerabilities, all annotated, underlined, bracketed in ink. She moved through them one by one, her eyes scanning not just for information, but for pressure points, sentences that struck, lines that couldn't be shrugged off. She paused on a paragraph from the DoD's Climate Adaptation Plan. Failure to account for climate-related disruptions poses measurable risk to force readiness, deployment, and national security. She underlined the words measurable risk, then drew a box around national security, then flipped to a NOAA graph projecting sea level rise at Naval Station Norfolk. She copied a line in the margin. The water isn't waiting for politics. That would go in the opening slide. Next, she reached for a leather-bound copy of the U.S. Constitution, bookmarked with a crimson ribbon. She turned to Article 1, Section 5, then down to the lines she had highlighted days ago, not knowing yet how much it would matter. Each house may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior. She skimmed further, then scribbled in the margin, respect in speech, equal recognition under decorum. Then she found it, the one she would quote on the record. No person shall be denied the right to be heard with full and equal standing in debate. She circled it. This wasn't just about climate anymore. It wasn't just about data. It was about the structure around her, the platform she had to fight to stand on, and how easily others tried to knock her off it with a smile and a condescending nickname. She opened her laptop and began building the visual deck. Nothing flashy, just sharp. Slide 1. A black screen with white text that read, "The climate threat is military business." Slide 2. Photos of flooded military bases. Slide 3. A direct quote from Weber, clipped and centered, "Calm down, little lady." Slide 4. The constitutional clause. Then back to data. Back to irrefutable facts. As she worked, her legal pad lay open beside her. Most of the page was filled with crossed-out notes, rough outlines, fragments of phrasing she'd tested and abandoned. But in the bottom right corner, where her hand rested as she paused to think, she slowly wrote one sentence in bold black ink and then circled it 3 times. "You called me a little lady. Let's talk about little truths." She tapped her pen on the pad once, quietly like a metronome marking time. She was ready, the clip was loaded. Not a soundbite, substance. Not a retort, reversal. And when it was time, she wouldn't raise her voice. She'd raise the standard. The second morning arrived with the kind of stillness that always follows the first shockwave, the kind that makes people lower their voices without realizing it. Outside the committee chamber, the usual clamor of aides and early press trickled in slower than usual. Conversations muted, eyes darting over shoulders. Something had shifted overnight, not drastically, but undeniably. It wasn't just that a line had been crossed the day before. It was that everyone knew the silence after that line hadn't been empty. It had been waiting. When Alexandria entered, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't posturing, but she was different, and everyone saw it. She wore a blazer in bright suffragette white, tailored, precise, intentional. The color wasn't an accident. It never was. She knew its history. Women had marched in white through the streets of New York and D.C. before she was born, before her mother crossed oceans to raise her in a burrow that taught her how to fight without ever throwing a punch. Wearing that color today was a quiet act of defiance, but also a declaration. She wasn't dressing for the camera. She was dressing for every woman who had ever been told to sit down while standing up for what mattered. Her heels clicked softly across the floor as she made her way to her seat. She didn't scan the room. She didn't need to. She could already sense the weight in the air. Staffers looked up quickly, then away. A few nodded subtly. Even the stenographer, usually stone-faced behind her machine, gave a glance that lingered half a second longer than usual. Across the chamber, Randy Weber was mid-conversation with another Republican member. They were chuckling over something, a meme or a tweet maybe, and Weber leaned back in his chair, grinning, elbows resting comfortably as if yesterday had gone exactly the way he wanted. He didn't look over when Alexandria took her seat. He didn't notice the change in posture. the unreadable expression she wore, the calm that had returned not out of peace, but purpose. He hadn't figured it out yet. That was the part that almost made her smile. The chairman's gavel came down with a sharp rap, calling the hearing back into session. Formal tone, measured pace, just as expected. Statements would resume, questions would follow. But the rhythm felt off, like the room had slipped half a beat behind itself. The usual power dynamics weren't quite holding. You could feel it in the way some members hesitated before speaking, in how the younger staffers suddenly had their phones out again, not for distraction, but anticipation. Alexandria took out her notes. Not the folder, just the yellow legal pad with the circled sentence that had become her touchstone. She looked down at it for a moment, then drew one more ring around the phrase, her pen dragging slightly under the pressure. You called me a little lady. Let's talk about little truths. She folded the page back over the rest of her notes, as if sealing it for later. She didn't need to read the data again. She had it memorized. Her hands were steady, her breathing even. But inside, something had shifted from coiled tension to deliberate momentum. She wasn't bracing anymore. She was aiming. And while Weber whispered to his colleague with the ease of someone who believed the moment had passed, Alexandria knew better. Because today wasn't just the continuation of a hearing. Today was the answer to yesterday. And it wasn't coming with fireworks or fury. It was coming with facts, with history, with one woman in white, ready to rewrite the moment they thought they controlled. The room didn't know it yet, but she wasn't the same girl who had walked in yesterday. Not even close. The hearing had only just resumed when Alexandria gently raised her hand. The chairman, caught mid-sentence, nodded toward her with a flick of recognition. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized, he said, the phrase customary, but this time the attention in the room sharpened with it. Everyone felt it, the pause before impact. I'd like to reclaim my time from yesterday, Alexandria said evenly, her voice calm, crisp, not defiant, not emotional, just controlled enough to command the room. She didn't look at Weber, not yet. Instead, she unfolded a single piece of paper from her notes, one neatly printed transcript. She held it at eye level as she began to read, without drama or emphasis, simply as fact. Calm down, little lady. You're not in a TikTok debate. No one moved. The room, so often a space of noise and layered interruptions, now felt suspended, as if every breath had been caught between pages. Alexandria placed the page down flat and folded her hands atop it. I want to make sure this moment is documented accurately, she said, not just because it was directed at me, but because it was delivered into a microphone, on the record, during a hearing on national security, and because it reflects something far larger than a single insult. Now she turned, slowly, fully, toward Weber. I am not here to make a spectacle of your words, Congressman. You already did that on your own. What I am here to do is name a pattern, and that pattern is this. When women, particularly women of color, speak with facts, with evidence, with conviction, there is a reflex, a need to diminish, to infantilize, to turn seriousness into spectacle. She stood slightly straighter as she continued, her tone still even, but colder now, measured with an edge that made each syllable feel intentional. This is not new. It's not rare. It happens in hearing rooms, in boardrooms, in classrooms. You don't have to say calm down to mean be quiet. You don't have to say little lady to mean less than. But when you do, it makes the message loud and clear. You are not ready to engage with the content, so you target the vessel. Across the aisle, Weber shifted in his seat. His smirk from earlier had faded, replaced by something less readable. Perhaps discomfort, perhaps calculation. Alexandria didn't wait for him to respond. I came here with the Department of Defense's climate threat matrix, with reports signed off by senior military leadership. I came here with facts, and I was met with mockery. Not because the data was flawed, not because the conclusions were weak, but because the person delivering them didn't fit the image of who some people still believe gets to speak with authority. There were no interruptions. Even the usual note passing among staffers had stilled. And for the record, she said, now directing her words to the full room, not just to Weber, I don't need to perform rage to justify my presence. I don't need to shout to be heard, because I am here, and I will stay here, and I will speak, with or without your permission. She sat down. No applause, no rebuttal, just silence thick enough to stretch across the chamber. The kind of silence that doesn't end a conversation, but begins a reckoning. The transcript lay on the table in front of her, its edges squared perfectly beneath her fingertips. And though no gavel marked the moment, everyone in the room knew it. A line had been drawn, not in ink, but in resolve. And this time, no one was laughing. She didn't pause long after reclaiming her time. The air was still heavy from what she had just said, but Alexandria knew that power, real power, wasn't only in the words. It was in the evidence that backed them up. So with the quiet precision of someone who came not to argue but to prove, she reached into her folder and pulled out a color-printed map layered with sharp red indicators, each one a warning drawn straight from the Department of Defense's own assessments. She held it up for the room to see, then placed it on the overhead projector. This, she began, her voice steady, is from the 2023 Pentagon Climate Risk Report. You'll notice the highlighted region here. Gulf Coast installations vulnerable to flooding, infrastructure collapse, and heat-related readiness degradation. Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Naval Base Galveston, Fort Sam Houston. These are not hypotheticals. These are in Representative Weber's district. Her tone didn't change. She wasn't accusing. She was simply holding up a mirror. The Defense Department refers to these bases as strategically essential and increasingly exposed. Their own language, not mine. And yet, she said, flipping to the next page, when I began citing this data yesterday, I was told, on the record, to calm down, as if raising legitimate military concerns somehow made me less credible. And then I was called a little lady while referencing information produced by one of the most powerful institutions in the federal government. She let the statement hang for a beat. Congressman Weber, she said without raising her voice, do you see the irony? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. And then came the sound everyone heard, but no one expected. A stammer. Weber shifted in his chair. I wasn't, he began, but the sentence crumpled before it reached its second clause. That wasn't meant to be, personal. Alexandria didn't respond. She didn't need to, because the murmurs had already begun. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Staffers whispering in the back rows, members leaning toward one another, reporters exchanging glances as fingers flew over screens. In a room where everyone had seemed half asleep just 20 minutes earlier, now no one could look away. She turned back to the committee. What I'm asking today is simple. Do we take our military's climate intelligence seriously, or do we let gendered language and casual dismissal drown out the urgency of what's in front of us? Because lives are at stake. Operational capacity is at stake. National readiness is at stake. She tapped the paper gently with one finger, then looked once more at the map glowing behind her. And yes, she said quietly, so is dignity. That was the final blow, not shouted, not pointed, but laid down with the cool force of someone who had spent the last 24 hours turning mockery into momentum. And it landed exactly where it was meant to. The room didn't applaud. It absorbed. The silence said enough. And for the first time that morning, Randy Weber had nothing to say. By late afternoon, the chamber had emptied out. The hearing was officially adjourned, and most of the members had already retreated to elevators and offices, still half processing what had just unfolded. Alexandria, for her part, had packed up quietly. No victory lap, no cameras, just her notes tucked away, legal pad folded, and that same quiet, unwavering calm she had carried in with her that morning. The storm had come and gone, or so it seemed. But then came the clip. It started as a whisper, just a low-quality video posted by an anonymous staffer, no tags, no captions, just titled Hot Mic. It was barely 12 seconds long, grainy and shaky, the kind of thing people scroll past without a second thought. Except this one had a voice, Randy Weber's, and what it captured turned into gasoline on an already smoldering fire. She rehearsed that whole damn thing, Probably practiced it in front of a mirror with her interns applauding. The mic had picked it up cleanly. The tone, the scoff, the dismissiveness that couldn't be mistaken for anything but contempt. It wasn't just the words, it was the sneer behind them. The implication that Alexandria's clarity, her composure, her precision had been theatrical, manufactured, fake. It reeked of a deeper frustration. She hadn't just embarrassed him, she'd done it without raising her voice, without losing control, without letting him drag her down. The clip took just under 2 hours to go viral. By the time Alexandria returned to her office, it was already trending. Not just among political junkies and staffers, but across platforms, TikTok, Twitter, even Instagram Reels. News anchors were replaying it on evening segments, looping it side by side with footage of her statement from the morning. Weber's sneer followed immediately by her saying, "You called me a little lady. Let's talk about little truths." The contrast was brutal and cinematic. Cable shows lit up. Pundits weighed in. Some tried to spin it as politics as usual, a minor gaffe. But the public wasn't buying it. People weren't just watching. They were reacting. Women across professions, from law offices to lunch counters, recognized the tone immediately. The way Weber's voice curled around that word rehearsed wasn't about performance. It was about punishment, for being too composed, for being prepared, for being unshakable. That night, #RespectHername was trending nationwide. Tweets flooded in by the second. She didn't just bring receipts, she brought the whole archive. Funny how men call it rehearsed when a woman refuses to be rattled. If little lady means commanding a room and silencing a clown, then call me one too. #RespectHername or step aside. Even high-profile figures chimed in. Activists, authors, veterans, celebrities. A former Navy officer tweeted, "I've been briefed by commanders who didn't handle themselves as well as Rep. Ocasio-Cortez just did. That wasn't a performance. That was leadership." Alexandria saw the clip late that evening, sitting alone with a mug of tea gone cold. She didn't flinch when she heard his voice. She just smiled, tiredly, quietly, knowingly, because she knew what that clip revealed. It wasn't just disrespect. It was fear. Fear wrapped in bravado. The fear of someone who had lost control of a narrative he thought he owned. She didn't tweet anything that night. She didn't need to. The country was already speaking. It started quietly, like most things that matter do. A comment thread on a Facebook post, a duetted TikTok, a stitched video response from a middle-aged nurse in Ohio with tired eyes and a voice that cracked when she said, "I've lived that moment." And then another, from a young software engineer in Seattle who recounted how she was called sweetheart in a boardroom after pointing out a flaw in a product's architecture. "The guy literally patted me on the back," she said into the camera. "Like I was 12. The stories poured in from everywhere. From women in courthouse elevators and construction trailers. From women at law firms, on oil rigs, in operating rooms, and behind diner counters. The exact words changed. Sometimes it was sweetheart, sometimes honey, sometimes just that patronizing laugh that lingered too long after a serious point. But the impact was always the same: to reduce, to reframe, to rewrite the moment as something harmless when it had never felt that way. A local news station in North Carolina aired a segment titled, "Not Just the Chamber, Women Respond to Capitol Moment," where 3 generations of women, grandmother, mother, and granddaughter, sat on a sofa together and spoke about how little had changed. "In the 60s, they told us we were lucky to be allowed in the room," the grandmother said. "In the 80s, they told us to act like one of the boys," the mother added. "The granddaughter?" She just shook her head. "Now they tell us we're dramatic if we speak like we mean it." But perhaps the most poignant contribution came not from television or print, but from TikTok. A creator in Detroit, username at Sister Archivist, took Alexandria's quiet, unshaken words from the hearing and layered them over the voice of Maya Angelou, reading "Still I Rise." The screen flashed images of women across decades, protesters in white dresses, factory workers, astronauts, athletes, students in hijabs and stethoscopes, and hard hats. "You called me a little lady. Let's talk about little truths," AOC's voice said. Then Maya's voice echoed, "You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. The remix had over 3 million views in 24 hours. Talk shows wanted her. Big ones. Primetime interviews, morning sit-downs, exclusive op-eds. One network even offered a town hall segment titled Women, Power, and the Politics of Tone. Alexandria's communications team was flooded with requests, more than they could process. Every hour brought a new invitation, but she declined every single one. Not out of avoidance, not from a lack of appreciation, but because she knew what moments like this could become if left unchecked. Personality circuses, talk show tours, branding exercises disguised as progress. She wasn't interested in being a symbol if it meant the legislation got ignored. The facts hadn't changed. The military bases were still at risk. The budget still needed climate provisions. Her voice was needed on the floor, not the couch. Instead, she kept working. She sat with policy staff and tightened the language of a climate resiliency bill she had been refining for weeks. She met with veterans groups, reviewed infrastructure maps, prepped testimony. When asked by a reporter if she would be responding publicly again, she offered only this: "I already said what needed to be said. Now I'm going to do what needs to be done." And still, the stories kept coming. Because when one woman refuses to shrink, she makes space for others to remember all the times they did. And decide, maybe for the first time, not to anymore. 3 days after the hearing, just as the online discourse began to quiet into simmering reflection, a new voice entered the conversation. Not from a viral clip or a talk show panel, but from the op-ed section of the Washington Post. It wasn't flashy, no hashtags, no graphics, just a plain text headline in firm serif font. "This veteran won't stay silent." The byline read, "Colonel Samuel H. Granger, Retin Army, U.S. Army," a name few recognized outside of military circles. But the words that followed would echo far beyond print. "I served this country for 30 years. I commanded troops in 4 regions, deployed during 2 wars, and stood in front of countless flags to remind young soldiers of their mission, their worth, and their duty. I did not serve so that a sitting congresswoman, one elected by the people, representing their voices with courage and clarity, could be dismissed in a hearing on national security with a phrase as small-minded as 'little lady.'" The letter went on, not with outrage, but with conviction. The comments made by Representative Weber weren't just disrespectful to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. They were disrespectful to every woman who has served, who has briefed commanding officers, who has walked into rooms knowing her voice would be doubted before it was ever heard. I watched the hearing. I saw how she handled herself, with composure, with detail, with unshakable command of the data. If that's called performance, then I wish more of our senior officers had trained for it. What I saw was leadership. The letter was short, just under 500 words, but it carried the kind of moral weight that couldn't be faked. It wasn't partisan. In fact, Granger identified himself as a lifelong independent who had voted for people on both sides of the aisle and criticized both when they deserved it. But what he wouldn't tolerate, he wrote, was the erosion of respect for women who did their jobs better than the men trying to silence them. "We don't send representatives to Washington so they can act like locker room comedians with microphones. We send them to do the work. And when someone does it well, especially under fire, they deserve more than sarcasm. They deserve respect." The final line was the one that got quoted, clipped, and printed onto protest signs. "I didn't put on a uniform for 3 decades just to watch my congresswoman be spoken to like a secretary who'd brought the wrong coffee." That sentence hit something deep. Cable anchors read it aloud. Activists tweeted it in solidarity. Even a few military-affiliated publications reprinted the op-ed in full, calling it a moment of truth from someone who'd earned the right to speak plainly. Randy Weber's office was asked for comment, repeatedly. They declined every time. No clarification, no apology, not even a denial. The silence spoke volumes. And by the end of the day, Alexandria's office had received over 600 letters from veterans, retired and active duty alike, some handwritten, some typed. Many began with the same phrase: "I saw the hearing. I saw what you did. Thank you." Respect wasn't trending anymore. It was resonating. The gavel struck wood with its usual crisp finality as the Oversight Committee reconvened on a muted Thursday morning. The mood in the room had shifted since last week, not in any dramatic way, but in subtle details that only the observant would catch. Staffers moved with more restraint. Members kept their voices low. The energy, once dismissive and distracted, had grown taut. This was no longer a room of easy laughter and inside jokes. Something had shifted in the balance, just enough to be felt. Alexandria arrived with her usual composure. No white blazer today, no obvious statement. Just the navy blue suit she often wore when she wanted to blend in, or at least be mistaken for blending in. Her hair was pulled back, her folders neat. But her eyes stayed sharp, and her presence, as always, filled her seat before she even spoke. Chairman Reeves opened the session with routine announcements, but a strange formality had crept into his voice, as if he were anticipating something unscripted. Then he glanced briefly toward the far side of the dais, where Representative Randy Weber sat, hands folded tightly atop a printed statement. "Mr. Weber has requested a brief statement for the record," the chairman said flatly. All eyes turned. Weber didn't stand. He didn't clear his throat or look out toward his colleagues. He just leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the sheet of paper in front of him. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that a comment I made during last week's hearing was inappropriate. Referring to Representative Ocasio-Cortez with language that may have been perceived as dismissive or disrespectful was not my intention. I regret the distraction this may have caused to the important work of this committee. I apologize." He folded the page once, then again, and placed it under his notes without lifting his gaze. The room held still for a moment, waiting. Alexandria didn't rush. She didn't smirk. She didn't look to the press in the gallery or toward the committee aides shifting awkwardly in their seats. She simply looked over at Weber, expression unreadable, then offered a single, firm nod. "Noted," she said clearly, "but not needed." She didn't elaborate. She didn't soften the edges. And that was what made the response so complete. It wasn't dismissive, it was decisive. It placed the burden of reflection squarely back where it belonged. The chairman cleared his throat and moved on quickly to the day's agenda. But everyone in the room knew they were merely pretending at normal. The pages turned, the witnesses were called, the discussion on infrastructure grants resumed, but the air was different now. Calmer, yes, but also heavier. Because what had happened over the past week had rewired something invisible in the room. And invisible things, once exposed, don't fade easily. Even Weber seemed changed, smaller somehow, not humiliated, but shrunk. The certainty that once animated his every smirk had dimmed. He rarely spoke during the hearing, and when he did, it was brief, cautious, a far cry from the man who'd once chuckled into a microphone. By the time the session adjourned, there was no need to recap. No trending clip, no grand finale. The moment had already passed, but its shadow lingered, because apologies, when read like paperwork, don't land with grace, and respect, once demanded and earned, doesn't beg for validation. It simply stays. That afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the office windows carried the soft orange glow of early evening, the kind of light that makes everything feel briefly suspended, clearer, quieter, more honest. The formal business of the day was over, but Alexandria had one more meeting on her schedule. Not with lobbyists or press, but with the summer interns, 7 of them, all young women, seated around the office conference table with notepads in front of them and questions written carefully in the margins. They were nervous at first, adjusting the cuffs of their sleeves, second-guessing when to speak. It wasn't every day they got to sit face-to-face with a congresswoman, let alone one who had just dominated headlines across the country. Alexandria noticed this immediately. It reminded her of how she'd once felt walking into rooms full of people who seemed to know the script before she even got a copy. So she leaned back, smiled, and said, "Okay. Who wants to go first?" A pause, then a hand, then another, and suddenly the room came alive. They asked about climate strategy, about navigating policy teams, about how to find mentors in spaces where no one looked like you. But then one of them, a quiet girl with curly hair and a scar just above her left brow, spoke without raising her hand. "How do you stay calm?" she asked. Her voice wasn't confrontational. It was curious, almost pleading. "When they say stuff like that to you, when they try to get under your skin." I think if someone said that to me, I'd explode. The room hushed slightly. Everyone looked at Alexandria. She didn't answer right away. She folded her hands in her lap and let the question linger. Then gently she said, "Because that's what they expect us to do. They expect us to scream, to snap, to fall apart under pressure, so they can call us emotional, unstable, too much. I don't give them that. I give them substance instead." A few interns nodded slowly. One scribbled the sentence down word for word. "I'm not calm because I'm not angry," Alexandria continued. "I'm calm because I am, and I want that anger to do something useful." She stood up and walked toward the whiteboard in the corner of the room, where one of her aides had left a list of upcoming subcommittee hearings. Her eyes scanned the names. Today was one round. There'll be more. Maybe next week, maybe next year. And they won't all sound like Little Lady. Some will sound like just playing devil's advocate. Some will sound like, let's not make this about race. Some will sound like nothing at all, just silence when you speak. But it's all the same thing. She turned back to the room. You don't win by yelling louder. You win by making it impossible to ignore the truth you're carrying. That's what they can't handle. That's what breaks them. Not your volume, your clarity. One of the interns whispered, "Wow." Another said, "I needed to hear that." Alexandria sat down again, softer now. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be prepared. And you don't need to take up space by force. You just have to refuse to shrink. The room was quiet for a moment, not because they had run out of questions, but because something had settled. A kind of lesson they hadn't known they were about to receive. Outside, the city buzzed with politics and pundits, spin and spectacle. But in that small room, something else was happening. Not a headline, not a clapback, a preparation, a continuation. Because the truth was, Alexandria didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. But she felt clear. And sometimes clarity is the first kind of power that actually lasts. The office was nearly silent now. Just the low hum of a desk lamp and the occasional distant sound of a vacuum cleaner from a cleaning crew somewhere down the hall. The city beyond her window was settling into its own rhythm. Horns less frequent, streets slowly surrendering to the hush of evening. Alexandria remained at her desk, alone, the whiteboard wiped clean, the folders closed and the headlines fading into the hum of tomorrow. She hadn't spoken much since the intern meeting, not because she was tired, but because the quiet had become necessary. After a week of microphones, questions, and public noise, there was something sacred about sitting in the stillness of a room that held her past, present, and purpose all at once. Her blazer rested on the back of her chair. A half-empty cup of tea cooled beside her, and her phone, face down on the desk, buzzed once. Soft, persistent. She turned it over and saw her mother's name. There was a voicemail, no text, no missed call alert, just the message. She tapped play and leaned back as the familiar voice filled the room. "Mija, I just watched the video, the one from the hearing. I saw how calm you were, how strong. Your abuela would be proud, baby. So, so proud. You didn't let them bring you down. You didn't give them what they wanted. You stood there, and you spoke like a woman who knows exactly why she's there. I love you. Get some sleep. You did good." Her mother's voice cracked slightly at the end, and then the line went quiet. Alexandria sat with the silence for a moment, staring at the small frame on the corner of her desk. The photo of her abuela, in that oversized church dress, smiling like she knew something no one else did. It had been years since she passed, but in moments like this, Alexandria felt her presence with a clarity that words couldn't quite hold. She pulled a worn leather journal from her drawer and flipped past pages of policy notes and scattered thoughts. On a fresh page under the date, she let her pen rest for a moment before she began to write. "They called me little." She paused. "But I built something big today." She underlined the sentence once, firmly, slowly, then closed the journal and exhaled. It wasn't victory in the traditional sense. There was no declaration, no parade. But it felt like something larger, a reclaiming, of voice, of space, of story. She stood up and crossed the room to switch off the light. In the dimness, the Capitol still glowed faintly outside her window, indifferent but ever present. And she, the girl from the Bronx who once waited her turn, and bit her tongue, now stood taller, not just because she'd endured, but because she had reshaped the very narrative they tried to write for her. Tomorrow would come, with more hearings, more noise, more battles. But tonight, in the quiet, Alexandria smiled. Not because it was over, but because it had only just begun. It didn't make front-page news. There were no press conferences, no dramatic announcements, no crowds gathered in corridors waiting for a quote. It came in the form of a footnote, buried 3 paragraphs deep in a procedural memo circulated to committee members on a rainy Tuesday morning. Representative Randy Weber would no longer serve as chair of the House Subcommittee on Energy Innovation and Workforce Development. No reasons listed, no explanation offered. Just a quiet sentence under the heading, Leadership Reassignments, Q3. But within the walls of the Capitol, no one needed the memo to say more. The context had been written in full weeks earlier, on record, on camera, and in the reverberations that followed. His words to Alexandria hadn't just sparked outrage. They had exposed a pattern, and once exposed, patterns tend to unravel. The party leadership didn't issue a formal rebuke. They didn't have to. The political cost had already been tallied. Letters from veterans, polls showing disapproval, editorial boards that once ignored his name, now questioning his judgment. In a midterm year, optics mattered more than pride. He didn't fight it. He didn't call a vote. He simply stepped down. The subcommittee met the following week without him. A new chair took the gavel. The agenda moved on. But in the silence of that resignation, in its absence of fanfare, there was something undeniable. Not a fall from grace, just a shift, a rebalancing, a quiet reminder that consequences don't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes they show up as a name missing from a title, a seat vacated, a door closing softly behind someone who used to speak a little too loudly. And somewhere down the hall, Alexandria kept working. She didn't need to celebrate. The moment had spoken for itself. 2 weeks after the hearing, in a quiet public high school just outside St. Paul, Minnesota, a civics teacher named Miss Lockhart stood in front of her 11th grade class and pressed play on a clip. The screen at the front of the room flickered, then filled with the now familiar image of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seated at the Oversight Committee, her voice steady, her words measured. "You called me a little lady. Let's talk about little truths." The classroom fell silent. These were students still learning how government worked, some skeptical, some disinterested, others just beginning to find their political voices. But something about the clip held their attention differently. It wasn't the scandal of it. It was the tension beneath the surface, the way Alexandria didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't retreat. She had been dismissed, but she didn't disappear. Instead, she clarified her purpose, and that clarity lingered. Afterward, Ms. Lockhart posed a question. What does power sound like when it's disrespected? Hands went up slowly at first. One student said, "It sounds quiet, but deliberate." Another offered, "It sounds like facts no one's ready to hear." Then a boy in the back said, "It doesn't fight. It holds the room without asking permission." Later that day, as part of a reflection exercise, Ms. Lockhart asked the students to write down a single sentence they'd remember. One girl sitting near the window wrote in loopy handwriting, "She taught me that silence isn't always weakness. It can be strategy." It wasn't a viral moment. It didn't trend, but it meant something. Because a girl in a classroom 1,000 miles away heard something deeper than politics. She heard the sound of a woman refusing to be small, and she listened. The auditorium wasn't grand, but it was full. Folding chairs lined shoulder to shoulder, a modest stage draped in a green and white banner that read, "People Before Profit, a Climate Town Hall." The crowd was diverse. Activists, students, union workers, elders with notepads and worn backpacks. Alexandria stood at the center. No podium, no teleprompter, just a microphone in one hand and her other resting at her side. She spoke plainly, weaving climate policy with lived reality, rising flood zones in working-class neighborhoods, asthma rates among Bronx children, military reports ignored by lawmakers more invested in lobbyist dollars than infrastructure collapse. She didn't raise her voice, but the conviction in her words filled every inch of the room. And when she came to the end, she paused. Her eyes scanned the audience and her voice softened. Not weaker, but deeper, firmer. When they call you too young, too loud, too emotional, when they call you small, remember this. So were the seeds that split concrete. There was a heartbeat of stillness, then a wave of sound, applause rising, people standing, some with hands over their mouths, some with tears. She stepped back from the mic, not to retreat, but to let the truth echo. And it did. This story isn't just about a single insult. It's about the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground without shouting, to lead with facts when you've been reduced to a label. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't win by dominating the room. She won by refusing to shrink in it. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And her calm wasn't weakness, it was power. Moments like these remind us that change doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it enters quietly, sits at the table, and rewrites the rules from within. What about you? Have you ever held your voice steady when someone tried to silence it? How did it change you? We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.